Say hi.
Hi. Hi there. Oh, I'm gonna get a little closer. Not have those guys typing in my head. Hi there. This is Kyle Shaw. I'm the editor at The Coast and the co-founder of The Coast. And I'm just about to have a chat with my longtime friend Stephanie Nolan, who's a internationally acclaimed, award-winning journalist who just wrote a giant story for The Coast here in Halifax. And it's about Northwood, the long-term care facility in Halifax. It's the biggest one in Nova Scotia and even the biggest one east of Montreal. And last year, right around this time, it was going through a horrible, deadly outbreak. A year later, Stephanie talked about it, and I've got the great pleasure of having The Coast publish it. And it's part of, we published it now for the anniversary, but we also published it now to really show people what The Coast has been working on lately. You may know us as a 30-year-old weekly newspaper in Halifax, and when the COVID arrived, that really, the shutdown of the restaurants and events and life made the newspaper shut down. We just closed it, and we haven't published every week since last March. We published a few special issues here and there, but really we put our attention into digital. The coast.ca, we see that's going to be the place, COVID or not, where we are going to be really serving Halifax in the future. And after we close the newspaper down, after we stop weekly publishing, the newspaper's not totally shut down. It's going to, we're going to keep publishing issues. In fact, we're going to publish Stephanie's story as a Coast, a print issue this Thursday. But it came out digital first, and that's where The Coast is going. We went into a bit of a COVID hibernation as we stopped weekly newspaper publishing, and we tried to figure out what should The Coast do now. Should we just stop? Just stop? Does Halifax need us anymore? How do we serve the city digitally? Oh, hi, Stephanie.
Hi. Sorry.
There you go.
How about that? Better?
Perfect. I'm just telling people about the membership model for The Coast. But hi everybody, this is our friend Stephanie Nolan, legendary journalist and current Coast contributor. Yeah, and Stephanie, I was just saying.
Coast fan.
Good answer. Good answer. Yeah, just saying. Through COVID, we really had to figure out what The Coast wanted to become in the future, and we looked around, and there's a lot of digital media services out there. There's a lot in Halifax. One of the best in the world is All Nova Scotia, which has really figured out the online business model. And there's the Chronicle Herald, the old paper here. It's gone behind a paywall. There's some talented reporters who are behind paywalls, trying to fund their journalism, and that just making people pay for The Coast to the exclusion of others. Just didn't feel like The Coast style, and we found the membership model, which is what The Guardian does in the UK, where we commit to being free for everybody, but we need some people to pay for it. And if you believe in the Coast mission, and if you believe in sharing information, and if you believe we can all make stronger Halifax together, and if you have the ability to pay, we really are asking and needing people to pay what they can to help us go forward and do stories like yours.
Journalism, not free.
It is very not free, and we're going to talk about what it took to tell this story, because I think people will be surprised to hear like the effort it takes to tell a story with such depth and impact and passion and concern as you tell the story. But I didn't describe what the story actually is. I just said it's about Northwood. Can you give a quick précis? That's going to be hard to do because the story is very, very long, and it's worth an investment of time. But how do you describe it when you think about it?
It's an attempt to explain how, given Nova Scotia's otherwise excellent record in the course of the pandemic, how 53 people died in Northwood in the course of 6 terrible weeks, particularly when Nova Scotia was fortunate enough to have a long time lead before the virus got here, and to have seen already what the vulnerability of long-term care was in other places, and to have a reasonable idea of what might protect people. It was an attempt to try to answer the question of how did we end up in that situation? Did we, when I started working on this story, what I kept hearing from people was, we did the best we could. And it was an attempt to try to answer the question of, well, did we really do the best we could? And did we owe people, the people who died in Northwood, something more than what they got?
Yeah. So you could see, the world could see the virus coming west to east across Canada towards Nova Scotia. And we could see that it was particularly devastating in long-term care situations. It's almost like a wave that you can see coming, and it's going to crash in Nova Scotia. Is that sense of an opportunity loss what got you into the story? Was it that macro health situation?
You know, what got me into this story very fundamentally is that Northwood is my neighbor. I can lie in my bed and I can see it out my window. And all through those very weird weeks last spring, when we were all locked down and living in this sort of uncharted territory, you know, Nova Scotia pretty quickly, compared to the rest of the world, drove the pandemic back, and we all lives back. And yet every day at the, you know, I would religiously watch the COVID briefing, and we would hear X number of new cases in Northwood and X number of people dead at Northwood. And I tried to imagine what it was like inside these walls that I could see from my front step. And I tried to imagine the fear of the people who lived there, and the people who worked there, and the people whose families were inside who they couldn't visit. I would pass them walking in my neighborhood. I would see people standing on the sidewalk trying to wave up at family members. And even at the time, I thought, like, this is a terrible, terrible, out of control epidemic, which we don't, you know, sort of outbreak that we don't seem to have elsewhere. I wonder how this happened. And when I heard that the province was going to conduct a review, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to be really interested. I'm kind of a big public health nerd, and I thought, I'm going to be really interested. I'm the kind of person who downloads the review and reads all the footnotes. I thought, I'm going to be really interested to read this. And then I realized that they had used this kind of obscure piece of healthcare legislation to do the review, and we were never going to see its findings. And we might see recommendations, but they weren't going to tell us kind of play by play the decisions that were made and who made them during those events. And that kind of made me mad. And then I waited, frankly, for someone else to do the thing that I did. I have a job, and I was not looking for this. But, you know, there's been some serious attrition in journalism in this region of the world in recent years. And the big investigation into what happened at Northwood didn't come. And I thought, okay, well, I'm sort of curious about this. Let me sort of ask some people. You know, it's a small town, and I met a doctor who worked there, and I met a nurse, and then I met a personal support worker, and then I met some families, and I started asking people, and I just wasn't getting any closer to any answers. It became clear to me that those people were also looking for answers and didn't have them. And then I sort of thought, okay, well, somebody needs to do some digging into what happened at Northwood, and I guess maybe that should be me. And that's how I started working on the story.
Great. Yeah, well, then you and I, you know, we met at King's College when we were studying journalism, and we both had good careers since then, going in radically different directions. Me going incredibly local, and you going incredibly international. And it was really fun. When you got really excited, when me and publisher Christina Reskovich, who was also at King's with us, and you know well, when we started talking about what the next iteration of the Coast could be, and what this sort of membership model of the Coast could be, and how a digital Coast could really serve Halifax. And yeah, you seem to really be interested in telling that story there.
You know, I have never done anything else, right? I got my first job at a paper when I was 14. I've never even waited tables. I have no other useful skills. I have watched journalism die underneath me over the course of the 30 years I've been doing this. I used to joke, I spent 25 years as a foreign correspondent, and I used to joke that I would eventually end up as the last foreign correspondent under glass in the museum. And then the museum closed for lack of funding, right? Like, this is like the, so I have been thinking a lot about how I believe that journalism is vitally important. I don't think that I think that just out of, concern for my own employment prospects. I think journalism, and I think this story is a good example of this, makes communities better. I think it provides a vital service in terms of accountability and transparency. And although I have been working internationally for most of the last 30 years, I think a lot about local news. I've worked in a lot of places where an unfettered and healthy local press could make a really big difference in some really big problems. And so I was concerned about that in Afghanistan. I was concerned about it in Brazil and in Mexico, but I'm also concerned about it in Halifax. And I was excited for you guys to try this. I think a membership model, I think we need to get people to think about why they will pay for Netflix and for Spotify and all these other things, but they want their journalism to be free. If it's free, you have to just really wonder about its value, right? You don't rely on a free streaming service, and you probably shouldn't rely on free news either. And I was really happy to be able to do this story. I had the chance, frankly, to write this story for other places, and I wanted to do it for Halifax, in a place where people who know and care about Northwood and maybe have family there now, or have had family there in the past, or have worked there in the past. I wanted to make sure those people read the story. But I also wanted to be a part of this thing the Coast is trying to do, because I think it's really, really important. And I think the Coast is really tied up with the identity of Halifax. I love this new mission statement that it's for people who love Halifax and would like it to be better. And I am one of those people. And so this was sort of my way of saying, this is what this organization is capable of doing if you support it.
I really appreciate you saying that and doing it. It's
Did you really appreciate it when I delivered you a 13,000 word draft story? or were you suddenly slightly less appreciative?
I was very appreciative that you refused to share the 20,000 word draft with me.
Yeah, okay.
Well, this is not a simple story. You talk to a lot of families. How do you choose? You talk to a lot of families. You dug into this story. First, how do you find them? And then, how do you find those people who have no other way to talk with media and who are being discouraged from talking with media, such as the healthcare workers? And then how do you choose who can make it into the story and who doesn't make it in?
Yeah, so probably 20% of the people that I talk to are in the story. So a lot of people 20%. In the story, and there's 5 more for each one of them, right? So, a few of those people had done media interviews last spring. And so I started by going through all the stuff that was written a year ago and tracking them down, which was not that difficult. And then, again, it's a small town. So one woman that I interviewed got talking to some people at the dog park a few days later, and she emailed me and said, I met 3 people at the dog park who had family in Northwood. Do you want to talk to them? Should I give them your number? And I was like, yes, I want to talk to your dog park friends. Social media is helpful. It's not actually, in this day and age, very hard to find people. So I called a lot of people who said they just weren't interested in talking to me, which was fine. I talked to a large number of current and former Northwood employees who did talk to me, but who would not be quoted even off the record because they feared for their employment. There were people who talked to me who said, I'll talk to you and tell you what I know, but I don't want to be in your story. So obviously they're not in the story, right? And then I was trying to, I talked to people who had nothing but good things to say about how Northwood responded. They felt their parent was very well cared for. They got a lot of communication, and they felt like it was extremely well managed. And I talked to people who had not a single solitary good thing to say, who were extremely virulently critical start to finish. And when you do 30 interviews, generally you try to stay away from the extremes, right? Like, you assume that those people are outliers, and you kind of try and stick closer to the people whose data points more or less align, whose experience seems to speak to what was broadly, more generally the experience, right? So that also kind of eliminated some people. And then you want to, if I'm going to ask a reader to stick with me for this long, you want characters who are people whose stories are going to be memorable and distinguishable and tell you, each one of those people who are there because they tell you something specific about what happened, about what we think happened.
I think by the end, like, these people become characters that the reader knows. You talk about Debbie Upshaw, and suddenly I feel like I know her and what she went through. One of the things I've gotten a lot of compliments about on your behalf, and I do pass them on. There's a point during the outbreak last year when Northwood was desperate for help, and Dr. Strang sent professional nurses from the hospital. He sent them to Northwood. Like, we're going to turn Northwood into a professional hospital, and everything's going to be okay. And it was like sending in the cavalry. And that's how we heard about it at the time. And in your story, you reveal it was not quite as simple as that. And also, you handle the tension that happened between the hospital nurses and the long-term care nurses. You handle it very, very sensitively on both sides. Can you talk about that culture clash and how you be true to everybody in that situation? How you deal with a hard, complicated issue?
The thing that I wanted you to do as a reader is what I did as a reporter, which is that every time I talk to someone on other sides of that story, I change my mind. So the first conversations I had were with nurses who said, it was batshit. We got there and people were wandering around and they were in and out of each other's beds and bathrooms, and they infected people and not infected people, and they were eating dinner together. And I was like, hold up. You're meaning to tell me that like weeks into this outbreak, everyone's still eating dinner together? And they said, yes. And they said, you had, people weren't changing their PPE, and it was horrifying. So I to me as a layperson, my immediate thought was, that is a shocking level of mismanagement. And then I talked to people on the other side, long-term Northwood employees, who said, look, like, this was someone's home. This was not a hospital, and quality of life and dignity is what is like the fundamental ethos of our care for people. And we were not willing to completely sacrifice that. And then when they said that, I would, kind of change my mind back again. I will tell you this. Probably the most letters or emails or calls that I've had since the piece published have been from healthcare workers who have been frustrated about that point in particular. And a couple of them have made it a point that I think is a really good one, which is that for a layperson looking at this, you think immediately about what they call life prolongation, right? That the goal was to separate people, and so like they shouldn't be eating together, and they should be staying in their rooms, and they should be locked down because they have to prolong their lives at all costs. And that, of course, life prolongation is not the primary goal of care when someone reaches the point of being in a facility like Northwood. The quality of your life, the quality of however many days you have left, and your dignity, and your loneliness, your isolation, your mental health, all of those things, those are the fundamental values that underlie care. And that, of course, that is the mindset that Northwood would bring into it. And people who don't work in geriatrics or long-term care maybe just wouldn't understand that. The nurses who came from the infirmary are acute care specialists, and they had been working in a COVID ward, and their whole mindset was control infection and separate people. That's not maybe the fundamental value of somebody who's managing care within Northwood, right? And so I think that's a terrible choice. I'm glad I didn't have to make it. I think for the reader, I'm just going to present it to you as a choice. I can certainly see from the perspective of family members who had, their parent or their sibling was COVID negative, and they were left in a room with someone who was positive, or they were eating with someone who was positive. I can see how that would feel very, very distressing.
Yeah. We'll just do a couple more questions. On the flip side, I know, and this draft ended up being around 13,000 words. You and me, we went over every letter, every comma, every space, every quote, every bit of implied meaning and stated fact. And, you know, as clearly as you lay things out so people are going back and forth and really trying to see what's happening in these difficult situations. One person you left in the story was Samir Sinha, the expert on geriatrics, and you quote him saying, "Everybody in Nova Scotia has blood on their hands." And I know you did not include that assertion lightly, but what has been the reaction to that? Because it's a heavy assertion.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of people are angry about that. A lot of healthcare workers are really angry about that. They feel that it's easy for him to say because he's not here and he didn't work through it, that he has no stake in it. And I would reject that assertion. I mean, I think Dr. Sinha is a widely respected geriatrician who has, I first went to him to talk about this because he's maintained throughout the pandemic this incredibly useful comparative chart of when each province did each thing. And so that was what first helped me unravel, you know, when did Nova Scotia choose to take various protective measures compared to other provinces? And that's why I first started talking to him. And then he turned out to have some very strong feelings about what happened in Nova Scotia. I think if you were a doctor or a nurse or a respiratory therapist who worked at Northwood during the pandemic, then that assertion would feel very insulting. And I understand that. I think he was speaking, though, to the larger population who maybe feel like, you know, what ability do I have to influence anything that happens to long-term care? You know, there's a part in the story where we talk about the fact that Northwood was extremely vulnerable because large numbers of its residents were in double and triple rooms. That is not the standard of care, the best practice anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time. And that Northwood has for years and years been asking the provincial government for the money to do renovations to make sure that would not be the case anymore. It's not like they didn't know how incredibly vulnerable they were, and successive provincial governments have not given them that money. And, you know, if you go back to before the Liberal government, you have cycles of provincial governments headed by other parties who also consistently allowed long-term care funding to be far outstripped by the level of costs, right? There's been no effort to keep the growth in funding to match the level of growth in costs, and it doesn't go anywhere near to meeting the amount of need for long-term care, right? There's 1,500 people on a waiting list right now. So, you know, I think that Dr. Sinha's, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think his point is that we have all been willing to let this situation in long-term care deteriorate immediately under our noses, right? When was the state of long-term care last a hot button election issue? Like never, right? We get fired up about how long we might have to wait for our knee replacements. We're not fired up by the fact that residents of Northwood get just over 2 hours of care in a day when, for example, the Nova Scotia Nurses Union has been advocating for years and years and years to say that the minimum acceptable amount should be double that they would need 4 hours of care in a day to be able to give people the minimum of what they need, right? That is not a hot button electoral issue, and it never has been. And I think it's in that sense that we, you know, when you make the assertion that we all have blood in our hands, like we are all to some degree responsible for the fact that long-term care was badly understaffed, badly managed, in, you know, crumbling infrastructure, not everywhere, but certainly in Northwood's case, that we, you know, in that sense, we do all have a role in something like this happening.
Yeah. So to wrap, over the weekend, there were 2 cases of not residents, but staff members at a long-term care facility in Dartmouth. And just in a, you know, it's just a horrible echo of the outbreak at Northwood, which was, you know, so certainly on my mind after reading your story about 18 times. And it seemed to me that you know, Premier Rankin and Dr. Strang seemed to have read your story. They took very quick action. They over in Dartmouth, after the second case was announced, they stopped letting residents eat in communal dining rooms and pushed them to eating in their individual rooms. So it seemed like, oh, maybe something has been learned, whether from your piece or from the outbreak. But like, how do we really make sure the lessons are learned? Like, is a public inquiry, do you think, a public inquiry into Northwood the way to go?
I mean, I know that's something that a lot of families want, and I think a lot of families joined the class action lawsuit because they felt like that was the only leverage that they had towards getting answers. You know, I'm going to assume, again, in our largely well-managed pandemic, that that these quick actions were taken in Dartmouth when staff tested positive because because we know now some things that you don't, for example, as someone says in my story, you don't have the luxury of time, right? You got to act immediately. I think that it would be possible for the provincial government to take the steps to release the findings of their inquiry in Northwood. And I think that before we spend the money on a public inquiry, which would take a very long time, release those and see whether the people who have a direct personal stake in what happened feel like that satisfies the questions that they have. See if experts like Dr. Sinha are satisfied, or Janice Keefe at Mount St. Vincent. Are they satisfied with what we learned from those findings? I think that Northwood could, they received a lot of praise for how transparent they were in the early days of the outbreak when they were posting on their website where the cases were, who they, floor by floor. I think Northwood could hold a town hall, virtually probably, but where they took people's questions and just really acknowledged that there are outstanding questions about what happened, the questions that are raised in my story. And again, that's also complicated because there is a pending lawsuit. So I understand that complicates what they can say. I think there are a number of mechanisms through which the questions that remain after my story and after, a year of people trying to understand better what happened, there are a number of mechanisms through which we could maybe learn more about what happened. I certainly feel like I don't totally know, right? I mean, after thousands and thousands of pages of documents and a whole lot of conversations, I still don't totally know what happened. And I would like to know better. And I know that there are a lot of families who feel that way. I will say about the cases in Dartmouth, one thing we know is that home is still vulnerable conspicuously to something that Northwood was vulnerable to, which is a lack of staff. If they have at least 2 known positive staff members, that means they have a ton of exposures. So all the staff who worked with those people must now also go into 2 weeks of isolation. And there just aren't the staff to, if that has a knock-on rolling effect, there aren't the people just standing around looking for those jobs. The new provincial budget had money in it for staffing in long-term care, and it's for this new class of employees called long-term care assistants, which is even below the level of a personal support worker, which is below the level of training of a CCA, which is below the level of training of an LPN. We don't. It pays $17 an hour, a PSW job, and it is backbreaking and grueling and risks exposing you to COVID, and people don't want to do those jobs. I mean, Northwood at any given time has, tons and tons of job vacancies advertised. So I'm assuming that the home in Dartmouth is going to have the same problem. They're very quickly going to run into a staffing crisis, and we've done nothing so far about paying and training and supporting and retaining people to do that care work better. We don't value that caring, and we haven't changed that.
So we know a lot of things to do. Even there's a lot of information still that could come out that has been gathered, and there's a lot of things we know how to do even before a public inquiry. Yeah. And now I guess we'll watch and see if any of it gets done.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that I heard from a few readers who were like, well, how can you say I have blood in my hands, right? I voted for the opposition. And it's like, really? Is that once every 4 or 5 years you cast a vote? And that's the full extent of involvement that you could have in this? I think that we could all do a lot about having a much more vocal public conversation about how long-term care should change. Yeah, sorry, I'll stop there.
It's probably a good place for both of us to stop. Okay. Stephanie, thanks a lot. That was really interesting. I learned stuff I didn't learn even in
asking all my questions. 13,000 word draft 5 times.
So thanks very much. And for anyone who wants to read the story, there's a link to it in our bio. For anyone who wants to join the Coast and help our mission to bringing more stories like this to Halifax, to bringing more passionate coverage to Halifax, to bringing a great digital news voice to Halifax, join us. We'll take, we need donations, any levels, any amount. Please join us and help. There's a link to that in the bio too. And once again, on behalf of all of Halifax, Stephanie, I want to thank you.
Thank you.
All right.